Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the machine quilting party. Today we're taking those log cabin quilt blocks and piecing them in rows to create our entire quilt top. We are going to be quilting this in one big piece, but please don't worry, it's really not going to be that challenging. I'm going to share lots of tips and tricks for setting up your sewing machine so that way it's easy to quilt with walking foot style quilting. So let's get started piecing our blocks together so we can finish our quilt top this week. So we pieced all of the blocks and now we've started putting them together. And I want to emphasize again, definitely watch the video on how to piece the log cabin block. And I tell the story about Dad and how he struggled with his seam allowance to get the blocks to come out exactly right. So Dad's blocks ended up all measuring 10 3/8 after they were finished. And that's okay. So long as all the blocks measure the same size, it's going to work and they're all going to go together nicely. If it's inconsistent, you have some big blocks and some little blocks, that's really not going to work. Best thing to do would be to trim up all of the blocks to one consistent size, and that's okay. So I have arranged my blocks. I've already started piecing them together into rows. And the most important tip with this here is to arrange the blocks so that way you're sure of the proper placement. So here we have a dominant blue block. So blue is the dominant color, and then green is the recessive color. I'm matching that with the same block here, green recessive, blue dominant. Over here I've got a blue recessive, purple dominant block, and that is what's creating this beautiful stair-step effect. That's what we're after with this quilt. So once you get it arranged, and I would work in rows, so arrange an entire row of the quilt so you can see it, make sure it's arranged properly. Then you're going to take and flip over the blocks, and you want some sort of signal to know what seam you're stitching, because you could take this to your machine and kind of get flipped around and accidentally sew that seam here, and then that would be all wrong, as you can see. So it's really important that whatever you decide to do it consistently to mark what seam you're stitching. So here's what I do. I flip over the block. I know that this is the seam I'm supposed to stitch, and I grab a pen, or in this case a Wonder Clip, and I clip it so I'm running perpendicular to the seam I'm going to stitch. So this right here signals to me that is the seam I'm going to stitch. So I take this block, flip it over just like that, and then I clip it. So it doesn't matter what system you use. Everybody has kind of a different system, but whatever system you use, make sure you keep it consistent throughout so you don't get confused. This is one of those things that's really important, and it can save you a lot of time with quilt piecing. When you get started and have like lots and lots of stacks of blocks, if they're all over the place and they're pinned really randomly, you won't know what to do when you get to your machine. Probably end up making a mistake, and then you'll end up having to rip it out. So work row by row, pinning together 2 blocks at a time with a system that allows you to know exactly what seam you're stitching. Let's take these to the machine and piece them together. So here at the machine, I'm removing the Wonder Clip, and then now I'm taking a look at my edges and making sure that the edges of my fabrics are in good alignment. You want to start on the right foot with those pieces just perfectly aligned, and take 1 stitch down so that way my needle's in the down position, and then I'm using a knee lifter on my machine. It's a bar that just raises that foot a little bit. I can also reach back here and lift my foot a little bit. And I'm pressing those fabrics right up against my needle so that the very next stitch I take is going to be onto those pieces. And that prevents one piece from slipping down below the other. Once I get my needle into it, then I start arranging the sides all the way down the whole block. So a lot of times I'll work all the way down to the corner, and I'll match that how the 2 pieces are supposed to end, and I'll just pinch that with my index finger and thumb and hang on to it, and then with the other hand just be sliding and smoothing those fabrics together so they stay nice and even as I stitch on down. I'm piecing with my patchwork foot. I've got my stitch length set to 1.5 millimeters, So it's producing a really nice, tight, consistent stitch. And then I'm lining up the edge of my foot with the edge of those fabrics. This is a 1/4 inch patchwork foot, so I'm getting a nice, perfect, accurate 1/4 inch seam. So you might be wondering about what thread color to use when putting this together. When it came to piecing the blocks, it was, it was easy. You could pick one dominant color, like in this case, red or black, to piece the block together. But when piecing the rows together, that's a little harder. So we picked a gray thread color, and that has generally worked out really well, and it's kind of blended in nicely. So that's worked out okay. So now stitch all the way down, maintain good concentration all the way to the end of that seam before you grab the next set of fabrics, the next set of blocks. And so really that clip, this is not in any way like holding these blocks together accurately. All this is a signal of what seam I'm going to stitch. So I don't get confused and I don't accidentally stitch the wrong things together. So again, line that up properly, lift the foot, slide the fabrics right up against that needle. So the very first stitch you take is onto the blocks. So I'm going to piece all of these together and I'll meet you back here when we're ready to start putting the rows together. So here are 2 rows from the Rainbow Log Cabin quilt, and they've been pieced together, and we pressed the seam allowances open. Look how beautiful all those open seam allowances look on the back. That's going to make the quilt so much flatter and so much easier to quilt over when we get to that step. Now, if you're wondering if that's safe for your quilt and not going to be somehow detrimental, I think this is just fine. Pressing seams open will result in a flatter seam, but keep in mind that I do piece with a 1.5 millimeter stitch length. That locks the pieces together so they're not going to come unpicked. It's very stable and secure. So I pressed all those seam allowances open, and now it's time to piece these 2 rows together and match these seams where the blocks come together. So I'm going to take this row and flip it over the other one, and now I'm going to work to match up these seams. So the first thing I do is line up the seams perfectly, and I flip back on the fabric so I can really see that and be able to see where that line is. And then I flip it back and make sure that the fabrics are lining up across the top too. So that looks good. Now I'm going to place a pin right ahead of that seam, just like that. The only seams I'm going to pin are the seams of the blocks. So here is a seam between that yellow and green block. And keep in mind that this is really not going to be all that noticeable if you get off. So if you are struggling with your matching seams, please don't worry about it. It's really not a big deal with a log cabin quilt if your seams don't match perfectly. It's not going to break the quilt. Definitely not. But it is one of those things to practice. And a lot of people struggle with matching seams whenever the seams are pressed open. And the trick with it that I find is really just careful pinning, paying very close attention to how your seams are coming together. And then another thing that I think is really important is your fabric preparation. So definitely go and watch that video on how to starch, how to press your fabric, how to cut it accurately, because all of that base step, all that preparation is going to greatly affect how your blocks are coming together right now. So I'm going to place one more pin right here and keep working down the line, and I'll meet you at the machine when we're ready to start sewing these rows together. So here at the machine, I'm taking a minute to make sure my fabrics are in perfect alignment, both across the edge of the quilt here and also across the edge of that row right here. So that looks really good. And things are definitely going to get bulky. As you are piecing the rows together, the quilt's going to start to take shape. And you might have a little bit of an issue kind of, just dealing with the row on your lap. So I'm going to back up the camera here so that way you can see how this is looking. I kind of keep the row here on my lap. And I do have my queen size Supreme slider here in front of the machine, and that's helping this to slide straight into the machine really smoothly. Now I'm making sure that those edges of the fabric are in perfect alignment. Sometimes one wants to kind of wing out over the other or just slips, so just watch out for that. And once I'm happy with it, start stitching on down. And I find with these blocks, it's good to kind of get started with stitching and stitch a bit way into it and then check your seams. So you might have more seams that match than just your block seams. You know, it really just depends on how you arranged your blocks together. You might have more seams that need a match. So just be mindful of that and keep an eye out for them. And also be feeling your quilt underneath your fingertips. You know, it's not just a piece of fabric. You know, your fingertips can be feeling if you've got any lumps or bumps or pleats or anything like that happening. So here I'm coming up onto a seam and I realize I actually have two seams that need a match here. So I'm going to pull back on this one and double check that it's in good alignment. A little tweak there. And now I'm pressing really firmly with my fingertip. I'm going to zoom in so you can see it better. I'm pressing really firmly here with my fingertip so that way those seams stay in perfect alignment as I slide right up and under the needle. There we go. Now, if you can't handle fingertip pressure like that, if that hurts, then you could always just put a pin in it, you know, pop a pin in it real quick. Dad sometimes struggles with that too, so that you're not alone and you can figure out other ways of doing it. I like that fingertip pressure because I find it saves just a little bit of time. I don't have to grab a pen. Now, my seam allowances were kind of winging up. That's why I lifted the foot and kind of poked at it a little bit. Sometimes you have to watch out for that. And a lot of times I'll lift up on the foot and double check the back of the seam to make sure it's not winging up too. I find most of the time though, my seams like to stay in place. And I think part of that has to do with starching the fabric before piecing. And part of it also has to do with using the Supreme slider here on the table because it's so slippery, it doesn't catch those seams and seam allowances and pull on them. So here I've got another situation where I need to match that seam. So I'm going to pull back on it and just ever so slightly off. So I'm going to tug down on that fabric just a bit, and I am going to pop a pin in it this time. There we go. And now stitch right up to that pin. So you want to try and avoid stitching over your pins. Here I'm flipping up to make sure my seam allowances are staying nice and flat. And I'm going to stitch right up to it, but I don't want to stitch over it because it's so easy to hit the pin with your needle. And that can bend the pin. It can also break the pin. It can also break your needle. It's not a lot of fun. And I just recently threw off the timing of one of my machines doing something like that. So I try and avoid doing things like that will end up with my machine in the shop for a few weeks. So now we're getting into the yellow section. It's really interesting how as you go through each color, it's going to change, you know, how it feels to be piecing it. With this, I can just see it so bright and I can see if any fabric is extending beyond the edge of this foot. So I think I'm probably going to piece more accurately through this section than the other sections just because I can see it so nicely. I know Dad always struggles with black, and those were the first blocks that he pieced were the black and red blocks in the corners. And when he got them done, he was like, I am so glad that those are finished because the black was just brutal. He couldn't see what he was doing and didn't feel like they were very accurate because he couldn't see the seams and he really couldn't see the edges, you know, couldn't see the edge of the foot with all that dark fabric. So that's one of those things to keep in mind. You know, working with bright fabrics might not be your favorite, but certainly can help you visually just be able to see what you're doing. That's really helpful too. Now we're coming up on another pin. Double check my seam allowance and stitch right up to it. I feel like that's kind of sliding a little bit. There's a lot of tips about piecing. There's a lot of things about piecing. You just really have to stay vigilant, very observant, and be constantly watching for different things, you know, watching your seam allowances, watching the fabrics, making sure they're not slipping away from one another, so making sure those edges stay in perfect alignment. It's not hard, but it takes a little while to train yourself to do all of those things at once. So, if you start to notice that things are off and you're feeling bothered by it, please don't worry about it. Every quilt you get better, every quilt you gain more skill, and you'll start to learn and develop those habits that will let you know, okay, now is the time to stop and double check my seam allowance, and now is the time to kind of shift those fabrics around, and now is the time to just put my foot down and stitch. It's like all of these little habits I take for granted now because I've been piecing for so long, and I try my best to talk through them and explain them because I know what that's like, and I remember what that was like to just not have any of those skills built. So we've made it to the middle of the row and things feel a lot less bulky. I've got a lot less of the row here on my lap, which is nice. And so it's just sliding so smoothly into the machine. I think it's coming together really nicely. So I'm finger pressing my seam allowances open first, and I just like to get my fingers in there and then drag a fingernail across that seam just to open it up nice and flat. And I like to be able to hear it. So I'm pressing pretty firmly. But of course, you can always use like a finger presser, they have wooden tools and stuff that you can use for that instead. So do understand there's lots of different options. If your fingernails are a bit brittle, there's other options for you too. And then once I get that seam open, I'm going to press with a hot, dry iron. And I am trying to remember to press here and not wiggle the iron around, because when you wiggle, it can start hitting the other seam allowances and cause some issues there. So I'm just pressing. Just set the iron down and press. That looks good. So the cool thing about a log cabin is just how all of the fabrics come together. And if you make a scrappy version with lots of fat quarters, then of course you're going to have different fabrics throughout. And it's going to look really scrappy and unique. But there are some places where the seams technically should match. And they should match, go straight across in these places. However, as you can see, that didn't really happen all that great for me. It was between Dad and I piecing this together, that seam just didn't end up coming out exactly right. And it's a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch off. Now you might be wondering, what am I going to do in this situation? I'm going to leave it. Because when I see that, I remember making this beautiful quilt with my dad, and it makes me really happy. And the memory of making this quilt makes me happy. So I'm not going to rip it. I'm leaving it in. And I know that when I see that in the finished bed quilt, it's still going to make me happy. So I encourage you, if you start looking at your quilt and you see issues like that, please don't feel an immediate need to go take a seam ripper to it and start correcting every mistake. Sometimes leaving in those issues makes a quilt more special and more filled with meaning. So that's it for this video. I hope that you realize that it's okay if your seams don't exactly match. That's not the end of the world, and it's certainly not going to stop your quilt from being a beautiful quilt. I look at this now and it's filled with fun memories of my dad and us working together. So to me, those mismatching seams actually make the quilt better, not worse. So consider that as you're putting it together, and instead of ripping, just accept that's where you are right now, and that's okay. Let's move on to the next step. So the next step is to begin machine quilting. So between now and next week, you need to put the whole quilt top together and get your quilt basted. And to help you out with that, I have just created a new online workshop on basting. So if you've never basted a quilt before, or you're looking to brush up, maybe try some new methods, definitely check out this new workshop on quilt basting. You can find it at leahday.com/basting. If you'd like to find the quilt pattern for the Rainbow Log Cabin quilt, you can find it in my new book, Explore Walking Foot Quilting with Leah Day. This book teaches you how to quilt 7 beautiful quilt projects, as well as 30 walking foot style designs. I can't wait to quilt along with you through several of these projects this year, so definitely pick up a copy of the book and let's start quilting together. Until next time, let's go quilt.